I answered an unknown number at 3 in the morning. My father's voice, harsh and demanding after 4 years of complete silence, cut through the darkness. "You need to get back here immediately and sign these disability papers, or we're all going to prison." The line went dead. I stared at my phone in my Chicago apartment, 2,000 miles away from the Colorado home my parents thought I still lived in. They never noticed I moved away. Now they needed me for something desperate, and the demand in his father's voice suggested my entire world was about to collapse. That phone call shattered the peaceful life I had built for myself in Chicago. 4 years of freedom, 4 years of becoming the person I was meant to be, and suddenly my past came crashing back with a single sentence that made no sense. Disability papers? Prison? I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. My name is Tony, and I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, with two people who happened to share my DNA but never really saw me as their son. Frank and Diana Morrison were my biological parents, but calling them family would be generous. From the earliest memories I could summon, I was invisible in that house. Not metaphorically invisible like some kids who felt overlooked, but literally invisible, as if I existed in a parallel dimension that occasionally intersected with theirs. Growing up, birthdays came and went without acknowledgement. I learned to buy my own cake from the grocery store, with money earned from odd jobs around the neighborhood. Christmas morning meant watching my younger sister Sarah unwrap presents while I sat in the corner, having stopped expecting anything years earlier. School events passed without parental attendance. Parent-teacher conferences happened without parents. I became expert at forging signatures on permission slips and report cards. While my classmates complained about overprotective mothers and demanding fathers, I envied their problems. At least their parents cared enough to be annoying. Frank and Diana treated me like an inconvenient roommate they were legally obligated to house until I turned 18. Dinner conversations happened around me, not with me. Family photos were taken when I was conveniently absent. When relatives visited, I was introduced with the enthusiasm most people reserved for mentioning their water heater. Sarah, 3 years younger, received all the attention I craved. She was the golden child, the one whose finger paintings covered the refrigerator, whose soccer games drew cheers from the sidelines, whose report cards earned proud phone calls to grandparents. I understood the favoritism was not about anything I had done wrong. I simply existed while Sarah lived. By age 14, I was working 3 jobs, delivering newspapers before dawn, mowing lawns after school, and stocking shelves at a local market on weekends. Every dollar went into a savings account I opened secretly, planning for the day I could escape. While other teenagers spent summers at camps or family vacations, I spent mine earning money and dreaming of freedom. The invisible treatment continued through high school. Frank and Diana attended every one of Sarah's theater performances, but missed my graduation ceremony. They helped her shop for prom dresses, but never asked about my college applications. When I received a partial scholarship to Northwestern University in Illinois, I celebrated alone in my room while they planned Sarah's Sweet 16 party downstairs. The day I left for Chicago should have been emotional. I had expected tears, arguments, or at least acknowledgement that their firstborn child was moving 2,000 miles away. Instead, Frank was reading his newspaper while Diana organized Sarah's college brochures. I loaded my belongings into a rented truck, said goodbye to empty air, and drove away from the only home I had ever known. For the first semester, I called home weekly. The conversations lasted less than 2 minutes before Frank or Diana handed the phone to Sarah or claimed they had somewhere urgent to be. I sent letters describing my classes, my new friends, the city I was falling in love with. The letters came back unopened, marked "Return to Sender" in Diana's handwriting. After a year of one-sided communication, I stopped trying. My sophomore year passed without any contact from Colorado. Then my junior year. Then senior year. And graduation. 4 years of complete silence. I built a new life with friends who became the family I had never had. I found mentors who celebrated my achievements and roommates who remembered my birthday. Chicago embraced me in ways Boulder never did. I landed internships that led to a marketing position at a growing tech company. I dated people who saw me as worth knowing. I developed interests and hobbies that had nothing to do with escaping my childhood. For the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. The strangest part was how completely my parents seemed to have forgotten I existed. No birthday calls, no holiday cards, no emergency phone calls about sick grandparents or family crises. It was as if Toni Morrison had never been born. While this should have hurt, it actually provided a strange kind of relief. The painful hope that they might suddenly care had finally died. But then, last month, something odd happened. I was scrolling through social media when I saw a post from my old neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She had tagged my parents in a photo of a church potluck, commenting about how wonderful it was that they continued caring for their special needs son at home. Special needs son? I stared at the screen, confused. Sarah was perfectly healthy, and I was 2,000 miles away living independently. I started digging deeper into social media posts about my family. Comment after comment referenced their dedication to caring for their disabled child. Church friends praised their sacrifice. Neighbors expressed sympathy for their burden. The more I read, the more disturbed I became. These people genuinely believed one of Frank and Diana's children was severely disabled and required full-time care. Since Sarah was clearly healthy and successful, working as a nurse in Denver, the only other option was impossible. They couldn't be talking about me. I was living proof of my own independence and capability. Yet somehow, my parents had convinced their entire community that they were caregivers to a disabled son. The phone call at 3 a.m. suddenly made more sense, though it raised far more questions than it answered. Something was happening in Colorado, something that required my physical presence and signature on disability documents, something that threatened to send my parents to prison if I didn't cooperate. I realized with growing horror that my 4 years of invisibility might not have been neglect. It might have been something far more calculated and sinister. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day investigating what my parents had been telling people about me. The social media posts were just the beginning. I created fake profiles and reached out to old family friends, church members, and neighbors, carefully asking casual questions about the Morrison family. The responses painted a disturbing picture. According to everyone in Boulder, I had never left home. Instead, I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown during my senior year of high school and had become increasingly withdrawn and dependent. People spoke in hushed tones about my social anxiety, my inability to hold conversations, my need for constant supervision. Mrs. Patterson, our former neighbor, sent me a long message about how proud she was of Frank and Diana for their devotion. She described seeing Diana loading medical equipment into her car and Frank converting the garage into what looked like a therapy space. She praised their decision to homeschool me after my supposed breakdown, explaining how public spaces had become overwhelming for my fragile mental state. The pastor of their church, Reverend Williams, expressed admiration for their Christian dedication to caring for their struggling child. He mentioned the financial burden they carried, the sleepless nights, the sacrifice of their social lives to provide round-the-clock care. He spoke about special prayer circles organized specifically for our family's situation. Each conversation added another layer to the fiction my parents had constructed. According to their version of events, I rarely left my bedroom, communicated only through grunts and gestures, and required assistance with basic daily activities. They described me as having the mental capacity of a young child, unable to manage money, relationships, or independent living. The most chilling detail emerged from a conversation with my high school guidance counselor, Mr. Rodriguez. He remembered me as a bright, motivated student with clear college plans. But when I contacted him, pretending to be a journalist, researching family caregiving stories, he told me a completely different narrative. According to Mr. Rodriguez, Frank and Diana had contacted him 2 weeks after graduation, frantically explaining that I had suffered a severe psychotic episode and would not be attending college after all. They provided medical documentation of my condition and requested that all my school records be updated to reflect my new status as a dependent adult with cognitive disabilities. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. My parents had been planning this deception since the day I left for college. They had systematically constructed a false identity for me, using my absence as proof of my incapacity, rather than evidence of my independence. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen, a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases. Within 48 hours, he had uncovered the scope of my parents' deception. They had been filing tax returns claiming me as a dependent with disabilities for the past 4 years. They received monthly disability payments from Social Security Administration in my name. They collected caregiver subsidies from Colorado's Department of Human Services. The financial records Marcus obtained showed systematic deposits totaling over $60,000 annually. My parents were earning more money from my fictitious disability than I made at my actual job. They had turned my non-existent mental illness into a lucrative family business. But the most devastating discovery came when Marcus accessed medical records associated with my Social Security number. My parents had somehow obtained documentation from multiple healthcare providers, confirming diagnoses I had never received for conditions I did not have: autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, severe anxiety disorder requiring constant supervision. The medical records contained detailed descriptions of symptoms I had supposedly displayed, medication regimens I had allegedly followed, and treatment plans I had never participated in. Doctors' signatures authorized treatments for a patient who had never set foot in their offices. The documentation was extensive, professional, and completely fraudulent. Marcus traced the medical records to a network of healthcare providers who specialized in disability evaluations. Several of these doctors had been investigated for fraudulent documentation in the past. Others had financial connections to advocacy organizations that helped families navigate the disability benefits system. The deeper we dug, the more sophisticated the operation became. This was not simply two parents filing false paperwork. This was an organized system designed to exploit government programs intended to help genuinely disabled individuals and their families. The most personal betrayal came when Marcus discovered that my sister Sarah had been told I was genuinely disabled. Phone records showed regular calls between Sarah and our parents, with Sarah sending monthly financial support to help with my care. Bank records confirmed that Sarah had been transferring nearly half her nursing salary to Frank and Diana for the past 3 years. Sarah believed she was helping to care for her disabled brother. She had been sacrificing her own financial security to support a lie. The guilt I felt about her unwitting participation in the fraud mixed with rage at our parents for manipulating both of their children so completely. But Marcus's most alarming discovery explained the desperate phone call that had started this investigation. The Social Security Administration had flagged our family's case for audit after receiving an anonymous tip about suspicious activity. Federal investigators were scheduled to conduct in-person interviews with all family members, including me, within the next 2 weeks. My parents needed me to appear in person and convincingly portray the severely disabled person they had been describing for 4 years. If I failed to appear, or if I appeared as my actual competent self, their entire fraud scheme would collapse. They were facing federal charges for disability fraud, identity theft, and mail fraud. Prison sentences could range from 5 to 20 years. The midnight phone call suddenly made perfect sense. Frank had not been making a request. He had been issuing an ultimatum. Either I cooperated with their fraud, or I would be responsible for destroying our family and sending my parents to federal prison. As I sat in my Chicago apartment, surrounded by evidence of my parents' systematic deception, I realized they had given me an impossible choice. I could protect myself by refusing to participate, which would expose their crimes but potentially destroy Sarah's life when she learned the truth. Or I could sacrifice my own identity and freedom to maintain their lies, becoming the disabled person they claimed I was. But there was a third option that Marcus had hinted at during our final meeting. Instead of choosing between protecting myself or protecting my family, I could choose to protect future victims by helping federal investigators expose the entire fraud network. The question was whether I had the strength to face my parents and the courage to risk everything for a chance at real justice. Marcus's investigation had revealed the scope of the fraud, but I needed to understand how my parents had pulled it off. The medical documentation was too sophisticated, too detailed, and too professionally executed for two people with no medical training to have created alone. I spent the weekend researching disability fraud schemes and discovered that what my parents had done was part of a growing trend. Unscrupulous families were claiming children as disabled to collect government benefits, often with the help of corrupt medical professionals and legal advisors who specialized in exploiting loopholes in the system. The forged medical records Marcus had uncovered contained signatures from Dr. Patricia Steele, a psychiatrist who allegedly evaluated me for autism spectrum disorder when I was 19. I had never met Dr. Steele, but her detailed reports described months of therapy sessions, behavioral assessments, and cognitive testing that supposedly confirmed severe intellectual disabilities. I called Dr. Steele's office, pretending to be a patient seeking treatment for anxiety. Her receptionist cheerfully explained that Dr. Steele specialized in disability evaluations and had extensive experience helping families navigate the benefits application process. She mentioned that Dr. Steele had developed streamlined procedures for documenting conditions that might not be immediately obvious to government assessors. The implications were chilling. Dr. Steele was essentially advertising her willingness to provide fraudulent medical documentation. The receptionist's casual tone suggested this was routine business, not an isolated incident involving my family. Marcus had also traced financial connections between Dr. Steele and a legal advocacy firm called Morrison Wrights Legal Group. The name similarity to my family name seemed too coincidental to ignore. Further investigation revealed that Morrison Wrights specialized in helping families appeal denied disability claims and maximize their benefit payments. The firm's website featured testimonials from grateful families who had received substantial disability payments with their assistance. Success stories described children with invisible disabilities who required full-time care, families who had learned to navigate complex bureaucratic systems, and parents who had found hope in hopeless situations. Between the lines, it was clear that Morrison Wrights was helping families like mine create compelling fictional narratives about disability to justify government payments. They provided legal protection, medical connections, and strategic advice for maintaining long-term fraud schemes. I discovered that my parents had been paying Morrison Wrights a monthly retainer of $1,200 for the past 4 years. In exchange, the firm provided legal cover, updated medical documentation as needed, and coaching on how to handle government audits or investigations. The most disturbing revelation came when I found email correspondence between my parents and their case manager at Morrison Wrights. The emails discussed strategies for handling my eventual return home, including plans for drugging me with psychiatric medications that would cause genuine cognitive impairment if investigators insisted on meeting me in person. Reading those emails felt like discovering that my own parents had planned to destroy my mind to protect their financial scheme. They were not just stealing my identity. They were prepared to steal my sanity if necessary. But the emails also revealed something I had not expected. Sarah was not simply an innocent victim sending money to help her disabled brother. She had been gradually drawn into the conspiracy over the past year as her nursing experience made her suspicious of some of their claims about my condition. Recent emails showed Sarah asking detailed questions about my medications, my treatment providers, and my daily care needs. Her medical training had made her realize that some aspects of my supposed condition did not align with standard autism spectrum presentations. She had been pushing for more transparency about my care. Frank and Diana's responses to Sarah's questions revealed their growing desperation. They had been pressuring her to prescribe anxiety medications for herself, claiming that stress about my condition was affecting her job performance. They convinced her that she needed chemical help to cope with the emotional burden of having a disabled brother. The medical records Marcus obtained showed that Sarah had been taking increasing doses of anti-anxiety medications for the past 18 months. Her prescriptions came from Dr. Steele, the same psychiatrist who had created my fraudulent disability documentation. Sarah was being medicated into compliance to prevent her from questioning the family situation too closely. I realized that my parents had been systematically destroying both of their children. They had stolen my identity and independence while chemically controlling Sarah's ability to think clearly about their situation. We were both victims of their scheme, manipulated in different ways to serve their financial interests. The federal investigation that had triggered my parents' desperate phone call was more serious than I had initially understood. Marcus discovered that the anonymous tip had come from someone inside Morrison Wrights Legal Group, The FBI was not just investigating my family's case, but was using it as an entry point into a much larger disability fraud ring. According to Marcus's sources in federal law enforcement, my parents' case was connected to at least 30 other families who had been creating fictional disabilities for their children. The total value of the fraudulent claims exceeded $10 million annually. My parents were small players in a criminal organization that had been operating for over a decade. The investigation had been triggered by a whistleblower who had provided evidence of systematic fraud, including detailed records of how families were coached to create convincing disability narratives. The FBI had been building cases against everyone involved, from the families claiming benefits to the medical professionals, providing false documentation to the legal advisors coordinating the schemes. My parents' frantic demand that I return to Colorado was not just about maintaining their individual fraud. If their case collapsed under scrutiny, it could expose the entire network and lead to federal charges against dozens of co-conspirators. The stakes were much higher than prison sentences for Frank and Diana. But there was another layer to their desperation that Marcus uncovered through financial records. My parents had not been saving the money they received from disability fraud. They had been spending it as quickly as it arrived, funding a lifestyle they could not afford through Frank's job at a local hardware store and Diana's part-time work at a dental office. They had purchased a new house, 2 new cars, and had taken expensive vacations while claiming financial hardship due to my care needs. They owed substantial debts to credit card companies and had borrowed against their home equity. If the disability payments stopped, they would face immediate bankruptcy in addition to federal charges. The realization hit me that my parents had not just been stealing from the government, they had been stealing from me, using my name and identity to fund their lifestyle while I struggled to pay for college and build a career. They had committed identity theft against their own son, then convinced my sister to financially support their crime. As I prepared to make the decision about how to respond to their ultimatum, I understood that this was not really about choosing between protecting myself or protecting my family. This was about choosing between enabling a criminal organization that was stealing from taxpayers and genuinely disabled individuals, or risking everything to stop them. The phone call that had shattered my peaceful life in Chicago was not just a demand for my cooperation. It was an opportunity to expose a system that was hurting real families who needed legitimate help. But taking that opportunity would require me to face my parents and risk losing the only family member I had left. I bought a plane ticket to Denver without telling anyone my plans. 3 days after my father's phone call, I was driving a rental car through the familiar streets of Boulder, my hands gripping the steering wheel as childhood memories flooded back. Nothing had changed except me. The mountains still dominated the skyline. The houses still looked prosperous and comfortable, and the Morrison family home still sat on Maple Street like a picture of suburban perfection. I parked across the street and studied the house where I had grown up, feeling like a stranger. The exterior looked exactly the same, but I noticed new additions that confirmed Marcus's investigation. A wheelchair ramp had been installed at the front entrance. Handrails lined the walkway. The garage had been converted into what appeared to be a medical facility, complete with a small sign indicating private care services. My parents had literally rebuilt their home to support their fictional narrative about my disabilities. Every modification served as physical evidence of my supposed condition, convincing neighbors and government inspectors that this was indeed the residence of someone who required specialized accommodations. I sat in that rental car for nearly an hour, gathering courage for a confrontation that would determine the rest of my life. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, I walked up the ramp my parents had built for the son they pretended to have and knocked on the door of my former home. Diana answered, and her face went through a fascinating sequence of emotions. First confusion, then recognition, then panic, and finally a forced smile that looked more terrifying than welcoming. She had aged considerably in 4 years, and I noticed the signs of stress that Marcus had mentioned. Dark circles under her eyes, nervous gestures, the appearance of someone living under constant pressure. "Tony," she said, as if my arrival was expected rather than shocking. "We have been waiting for you." Frank appeared behind her, and I saw the same stress signals. But where Diana looked frightened, Frank looked angry. His jaw was set in the stubborn expression I remembered from childhood arguments. He gestured for me to enter as if I was late for an appointment rather than returning after 4 years of complete absence. The interior of the house confirmed every detail of Marcus's investigation. Medical equipment filled the living room. Hospital-style furniture had replaced the comfortable couches I remembered. Medication charts covered the refrigerator. Everything had been staged to support the illusion that a severely disabled person lived here. But the most disturbing sight was my bedroom, which my parents insisted I see immediately. It had been converted into a medical facility, with a hospital bed, monitoring equipment, and restraint devices mounted on the walls. Charts documented my supposed daily routine, medication schedule, and behavioral patterns. It looked like the room of someone who required institutional care. "This is what we have built for you," Frank said, his voice containing equal parts pride and threat. "This is the life we have created to keep our family together." I stared at the room that represented 4 years of their systematic lies and realized they genuinely expected me to be grateful. In their minds, they had been protecting and providing for me, rather than exploiting and manipulating me. They had convinced themselves that fraud was a form of family loyalty. Diana produced a folder of documents that needed my signature. Disability benefit renewals, medical consent forms, legal guardianship papers. Each document reinforced their control over my identity and their right to make decisions about my life. Signing them would make me complicit in their crimes while surrendering my independence. "The federal investigators will be here next week," Frank explained matter-of-factly. "You need to be prepared to demonstrate your condition convincingly. We have coached Sarah on what to say about your care needs. We have arranged for Dr. Steele to be present during the interviews to provide medical support." The casual way he discussed deceiving federal investigators revealed how completely my parents had embraced their criminal behavior. This was not a desperate family, making poor decisions under pressure. This was an organized operation run by people who felt entitled to steal money using their children's identities. I asked about Sarah, and Diana's expression became defensive. She explained that Sarah had been struggling with anxiety about my condition and was taking medication to help her cope with the stress. She said Sarah would be joining us for dinner, so we could all coordinate our stories for the upcoming investigation. When Sarah arrived an hour later, I barely recognized my sister. The confident, capable nurse I had last seen 4 years ago had been replaced by someone who appeared fragile and uncertain. Her movements were slow, her speech was slightly slurred, and she seemed to have difficulty focusing on conversations. The medications they had convinced her to take were clearly affecting her cognitive function, but when Sarah saw me, something shifted in her expression. Despite the chemical fog, she recognized that I was not the severely disabled person our parents had described. Her nursing training had given her enough medical knowledge to realize that my appearance, behavior, and communication skills did not match my supposed diagnoses. "Tony looks different than I expected," she said quietly, causing Frank and Diana to exchange nervous glances. "The medications have been helping him," Diana explained quickly. "He has good days and bad days." I realized this was my moment to either embrace their lies or destroy them. If I played along with their deception, I could protect Sarah from learning about her unwitting participation in fraud. But I would become trapped in a life of pretending to be mentally disabled. If I told the truth, I could free both of us from their manipulation. But I would expose Sarah to the devastating realization that she had been funding our parents' crimes for years. Looking at my drugged sister and my desperate parents, I made the choice that would define the rest of our lives. "Sarah," I said clearly, "I need to tell you something important about what has really been happening in our family." The look of terror that crossed Frank and Diana's faces told me I had made the right decision. But as I began explaining the truth to my sister, I realized my parents were not going to let me destroy their operation without a fight. Frank moved toward the medication cart they had prepared for my supposed treatment, and I understood that they had been prepared to drug me into compliance if necessary. They had planned this confrontation and were ready to use force to maintain their control. The next few minutes would determine whether I would become the victim they needed me to be, or the witness who would bring down their entire criminal enterprise. Sarah's reaction to my revelation was everything I had feared and hoped for simultaneously. As the chemical fog of her medications wore off during our conversation, her nursing training kicked in, and she began asking pointed medical questions that my parents could not answer. If Tony has severe autism, she asked Diana, why does he make normal eye contact and use complex language? If he requires constant supervision, she asked Frank, how did he get here from Chicago by himself? If he has intellectual disabilities, she asked both of them, why can he discuss medical concepts more accurately than your explanations? Each question stripped away another layer of their carefully constructed lies. But what devastated Sarah most was not discovering that I was healthy and independent. What destroyed her was realizing that she had been systematically manipulated and medicated to prevent her from asking these obvious questions earlier. How long have you been giving me those pills? She asked Diana, her voice barely above a whisper. Just anxiety medication to help you cope, Diana replied. But her defensive tone confirmed Sarah's growing suspicions. Anxiety medication does not cause cognitive impairment unless the dosage is deliberately excessive, Sarah said, her professional knowledge cutting through years of manipulation. You have been drugging me to keep me compliant. The confrontation that followed was the most painful conversation I had ever witnessed. Sarah, despite her nursing career and medical education, had trusted our parents completely. She had believed their stories about my condition, sent them money she could not afford, and accepted medications that were designed to prevent her from thinking clearly about their claims. But as the truth emerged, Sarah's anger surprised me. She was not devastated by learning about my independence. She was furious about being manipulated into funding fraud. She was enraged that our parents had stolen from government programs intended to help genuinely disabled individuals and their families. She was livid that they had used her professional reputation as a nurse to add credibility to their medical lies. Do you understand what you have done to my career? She asked Frank and Diana. If this fraud is exposed, I could lose my nursing license for participating in falsified medical documentation. You have destroyed my professional credibility to fund your lifestyle. This angle had not occurred to me, but Sarah was right. Her involvement in the scheme, even unwitting, could end her nursing career. Professional medical boards took fraud allegations seriously, and her financial support of falsified disability claims could be interpreted as professional misconduct. Sarah demanded to see all the financial records related to their fraud scheme. When Frank refused, she threatened to call federal investigators immediately. When Diana tried to convince her that she was having another anxiety episode, Sarah demanded a blood test to prove that she had been over-medicated. But the most explosive revelation came when Sarah accessed the family computer and discovered the email correspondence with Morrison Wright's legal group. Reading those messages, she learned that our parents had been planning to drug me into genuine cognitive impairment, if necessary to maintain their fraud. You were going to poison your own son, she said, her voice filled with horror. You were willing to destroy his mind permanently to avoid prosecution. Frank's response revealed the depth of his self-deception. He claimed that everything they had done was to keep the family together. He said that the money from disability fraud had allowed them to maintain their lifestyle and continue supporting Sarah's career. He insisted that they were victims of a system that did not adequately support struggling families. But Sarah saw through his rationalizations immediately. You stole over $200,000, she said. You committed identity theft against your own children. You convinced me to fund your crimes while drugging me to prevent me from discovering the truth. Nothing about this was about family loyalty. The argument escalated when Diana produced a syringe filled with what she claimed was Tony's normal evening medication. She insisted that I needed to take the injection to maintain consistency with my medical records. Sarah recognized the medication as a powerful antipsychotic that would cause genuine cognitive impairment if administered to someone without mental illness. That is not anxiety medication, Sarah said. That is haloperidol, and it will cause permanent neurological damage if given to someone who does not need it. The realization that our parents had been prepared to chemically lobotomize me rather than face prosecution pushed both Sarah and me past any remaining loyalty or sympathy. We were not dealing with desperate parents making poor decisions. We were confronting criminals who were willing to destroy their children's minds to protect their fraudulent income. Sarah made the decision that saved both of our lives. She called 911 and reported that our parents were attempting to administer dangerous psychiatric medications to someone without proper medical indication. She identified herself as a registered nurse, witnessing attempted assault with a dangerous substance. While we waited for emergency responders, Sarah and I gathered every piece of evidence we could find: financial records, email correspondence, fraudulent medical documentation, and prescription bottles filled with medications that had been keeping Sarah compliant. We collected proof of a criminal operation that had been exploiting government programs for 4 years. But our parents made one final attempt to regain control. Frank called Morrison Wright's legal group and reported that their disabled son had been kidnapped by strangers who were impersonating family members. He claimed that Sarah was having a psychotic break and could not be trusted to make rational decisions about family matters. Within minutes, representatives from Morrison Wright's arrived at the house, along with Dr. Steele and what appeared to be private security personnel. They had come prepared to forcibly remove me from the scene and transport me to a private medical facility where I could be held for psychiatric evaluation. "This is a coordinated criminal organization," Sarah said as we watched them surround the house. "They have been prepared for the possibility that their fraud would be exposed." The next hour became a standoff between family loyalty and criminal justice. Our parents and their co-conspirators were demanding that I submit to their control voluntarily, while Sarah and I were insisting that federal investigators needed to examine the evidence we had collected. But as I looked at my sister, who had sacrificed her financial security and professional reputation to unknowingly support our parents' crimes, I realized that the stakes were bigger than just our family. This was about protecting other families from similar manipulation and ensuring that government programs intended to help genuinely disabled individuals were not exploited by criminal organizations. The sound of sirens approaching meant that our decision was about to be tested in ways neither of us was prepared for. The arrival of emergency responders created chaos that revealed just how organized the fraud operation had become. Within minutes of Sarah's 911 call, our house was surrounded by police, paramedics, federal agents, and representatives from Morrison Wright's legal group, all claiming authority over the situation. Dr. Steele immediately approached the paramedics with official medical documentation, identifying me as a severely disabled patient who required immediate psychiatric intervention. She claimed I was having a psychotic episode and needed to be transported to a specialized facility for my own safety. Her credentials and professional demeanor gave her statements significant credibility with first responders. But Sarah's nursing license allowed her to challenge Dr. Steele's recommendations with equal professional authority. She provided her own assessment of my mental status, contradicted the medical documentation, and requested that blood tests be performed to prove that the medications in my system did not match my supposed diagnoses. The standoff between two medical professionals created enough confusion for federal agents to take control of the scene. Agent Patricia Collins identified herself as the lead investigator in the disability fraud case and announced that this residence was now part of an active federal investigation. What happened next revealed that my parents' operation was far more sophisticated than even Marcus's investigation had uncovered. Morrison Wright's legal group had anticipated the possibility of federal intervention and had prepared legal countermeasures. Their attorney, James Morrison, no relation despite the name, arrived with court orders, granting them temporary guardianship over me based on my documented disabilities. "Mr. Anthony Morrison has been declared legally incompetent," Attorney Morrison announced. "My clients have court-approved authority to make medical and legal decisions on his behalf. Any interference with his treatment constitutes violation of guardianship orders." I stared at the legal documents and realized my parents had somehow obtained court orders making them my legal guardians without my knowledge or participation. They had used fraudulent medical documentation to convince a judge that I was mentally incapable of managing my own affairs. On paper, I was legally no different from a minor child or someone with severe dementia. Agent Collins examined the guardianship papers and confirmed they appeared legitimate. According to Colorado law, she could not prevent my legal guardians from making medical decisions about my care, even if I objected. The court orders gave Frank and Diana legal authority to have me forcibly medicated or hospitalized against my will. But Sarah's presence complicated their plans. As a registered nurse, she could not be dismissed as easily as other family members. Her professional assessment of my mental status carried legal weight, and her documentation of the excessive medications they had been giving her provided evidence of systematic manipulation. "I am requesting a formal competency evaluation," Sarah announced to Agent Collins. "As a medical professional, I am reporting suspected elder abuse and fraud involving vulnerable adult exploitation." This was the moment when years of planning collided with unexpected resistance. My parents and their legal team had prepared for the possibility that I might refuse to cooperate, but they had not anticipated that Sarah would turn against them, or that her medical expertise would undermine their documentation. Attorney Morrison tried to dismiss Sarah's concerns by claiming she was experiencing medication-induced paranoia, but Agent Collins pointed out that Sarah's professional license required her to report suspected abuse, regardless of her personal relationship to the involved parties. The legal battle continued for hours, as different authorities tried to determine who had jurisdiction over my case. My parents insisted they were protecting their disabled son from exploitation by strangers. Sarah argued she was protecting her brother from criminal abuse by their parents. Federal agents wanted to investigate potential fraud. Local police were trying to manage a domestic dispute that involved multiple conflicting legal claims. But the breakthrough came when I made a decision that none of them had anticipated. I asked Agent Collins if I could voluntarily submit to federal investigation as a cooperating witness in exchange for protection from the guardianship orders that my parents had obtained fraudulently. "I am offering to testify against everyone involved in this fraud scheme," I announced. "In exchange, I want federal protection from forced medication and illegal guardianship, and I want my sister protected from prosecution for her unwitting participation." Agent Collins explained that federal witness protection was available for people providing testimony in major fraud cases. If I could prove that the guardianship orders had been obtained through fraudulent documentation, federal authorities could challenge their validity and provide legal protection while I testified. This offer changed the dynamic completely. Morrison Wright's legal group realized that their star witness was about to become their primary accuser. My parents understood that their disabled son was about to expose them as criminals. Dr. Steele recognized that her medical license was in jeopardy if I testified about her fraudulent documentation, but their desperation led them to make the mistake that would destroy them. Attorney Morrison authorized Dr. Steele to administer emergency psychiatric medication to prevent me from making what he claimed were irrational decisions while experiencing a psychotic episode. Dr. Steele prepared an injection of haloperidol, the same drug that would have caused genuine cognitive impairment if administered in the dosages she was prescribing. But before she could inject me, Sarah physically intervened and demanded that Agent Collins witness what was about to happen. "They are attempting to chemically lobotomize a healthy person to prevent him from testifying about their crimes," Sarah announced. "This is not medical treatment. This is obstruction of justice, using dangerous psychiatric drugs." The moment when Dr. Steele tried to forcibly inject me while Agent Collins watched marked the end of their fraud operation. Federal agents had witnessed an organized attempt to prevent a cooperating witness from providing testimony by chemically disabling him. The crime was no longer just disability fraud. It was conspiracy to obstruct federal investigation using dangerous medical procedures. Agent Collins immediately arrested Dr. Steele for attempted assault with a dangerous substance. Attorney Morrison was arrested for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Frank and Diana were arrested for disability fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit witness tampering. But the arrests were just the beginning. Agent Collins explained that my testimony could help expose a criminal network that had been operating across multiple states for over a decade. The evidence Sarah and I had collected could help federal prosecutors build cases against dozens of conspirators who had been stealing millions of dollars from programs intended to help genuinely disabled individuals. As I watched my parents being led away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. The family that had never seen me was finally gone, but the opportunity to protect other families from similar exploitation was just beginning. The question now was whether Sarah and I could rebuild our relationship after years of manipulation and discover what family really meant when it was based on love rather than lies. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Denver, watching my parents and their co-conspirators receive sentences that reflected the scope of their crimes. Frank and Diana each received 12 years in federal prison for disability fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and attempted witness tampering. Dr. Steele received 15 years for medical fraud and attempted assault. Attorney Morrison received 10 years for conspiracy to obstruct justice, but the convictions extended far beyond my family. The evidence Sarah and I had provided helped federal prosecutors dismantle an entire criminal network that had been operating across 7 states. Morrison Wright's legal group was revealed to be the coordination center for a fraud scheme that had stolen over $15 million from disability programs intended to help genuinely disabled individuals and their families. 37 families were prosecuted for creating fictional disabilities for their children. 19 medical professionals lost their licenses for providing fraudulent documentation. 8 legal firms that specialized in disability fraud were disbanded. The investigation led to congressional hearings about gaps in oversight systems that had allowed such systematic exploitation to continue for over a decade. My testimony was crucial in securing convictions, but the real heroes were the federal investigators who had spent years building cases against everyone involved. Agent Collins explained that my willingness to cooperate had provided the inside perspective needed to understand how families were recruited, coached, and protected by the criminal organization. The most satisfying aspect of the prosecutions was seeing resources return to their intended purposes. The money recovered from fraud schemes was redirected to legitimate disability advocacy programs, including organizations that helped families navigate complex benefit systems without resorting to fraud. Sarah and I established a foundation called Authentic Family Support to help other families who had been manipulated into participating in fraud schemes. We discovered that many people had been victimized in ways similar to Sarah's experience, convinced to support fake disabilities through emotional manipulation and chemical dependency. Sarah's recovery from the medications our parents had been giving her took several months, but her nursing license was protected because investigators confirmed she had been drugged without her knowledge to prevent her from recognizing the fraud. Her professional reputation was actually enhanced by her role in exposing the criminal network. The foundation work allowed Sarah and I to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. For the first time in our lives, we were able to be siblings without the interference of parents who had manipulated us in different ways to serve their criminal interests. Sarah decided to move to Chicago, where she found work at a children's hospital specializing in developmental disabilities. Her experience with our family's fraud had given her unique insight into the challenges facing families with genuinely disabled children. She became an advocate for better oversight systems that could distinguish between legitimate need and fraudulent claims. I returned to my marketing career with a deeper appreciation for the chosen family I had built in Chicago. My colleagues and friends had supported me throughout the investigation and trial, providing the emotional stability that had been missing from my childhood. They celebrated the justice outcomes as if they were personally invested in my family's healing. But the most meaningful change was my relationship with disability advocacy communities. Through the foundation work, I met families who were struggling to care for genuinely disabled children and adults. I learned about the daily challenges they faced, the inadequate resources available to them, and the damage that fraud schemes cause to public support for disability programs. These families taught me that my parents' crimes had hurt far more than just our family. Every dollar they stole was money that could have supported legitimate needs. Every false claim they made created skepticism about real disabilities. Every fraudulent document they filed made it harder for genuine cases to be approved quickly. Working with authentic disability advocacy organizations gave me perspective on what my childhood could have been if my parents had channeled their energy into supporting rather than exploiting their children. I met parents who sacrificed everything to provide appropriate care for disabled children, and I admired their dedication in ways that made my own parents' selfishness seem even more contemptible. The legal resolution of our case also provided closure about my own identity. The fraudulent guardianship orders were overturned, the false medical records were expunged, and my Social Security number was cleared of all fraudulent disability claims. For the first time since turning 18, I was legally free to make my own decisions about my life. Sarah and I used the foundation as a platform to advocate for legislative changes that would make similar fraud more difficult in the future. We testified before congressional committees about the need for better verification systems, more robust oversight of medical documentation, and stronger penalties for families and professionals who exploited disability programs. But beyond the policy work, we found personal healing in helping other families rebuild after similar trauma. We discovered that criminal exploitation within families was more common than most people realized, and that many victims needed support to understand that they were not responsible for their relatives' crimes. The Foundation's support groups included adult children who had discovered that their parents had been claiming them as disabled, siblings who had unknowingly funded fraudulent schemes, and medical professionals who had been manipulated into providing inappropriate documentation. Each person's story reinforced how important it was to speak out against exploitation wherever it occurred. 1 year after the arrests, Sarah and I returned to Boulder for the first time since the trial. The house where we had grown up was being sold to pay restitution to the federal government. We walked through the empty rooms where so much manipulation had occurred and felt grateful that those chapters of our lives were finally closed. But we also planted a tree in the front yard, with a plaque dedicating it to families affected by disability fraud. We wanted the neighborhood to remember what had happened, and to be vigilant about protecting vulnerable community members from similar exploitation in the future. As we drove away from Boulder that day, Sarah and I talked about the family we were building together based on honesty, mutual support, and shared values. We had learned that family was not about blood relations or legal obligations, but about people who chose to care for each other authentically. The Foundation work continued to grow, reaching families across the country who needed support after discovering they had been victimized by criminal relatives. Each success story reminded us that speaking out against exploitation, even when it involved family members, was an act of love rather than betrayal. My parents had stolen 4 years of my identity and independence, but they had inadvertently given me something more valuable: the motivation to help other families avoid similar trauma, and the knowledge that real family relationships were built on respect rather than manipulation. Looking back on that terrifying phone call at 3 in the morning, I realized it had been the beginning of my real life rather than a threat to the life I had built. My parents' desperation had finally forced a reckoning that allowed Sarah and me to discover who we really were when we were free to choose our own identities. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was living a completely different version of the truth than what you experienced? How did you find the courage to confront a situation where family loyalty conflicted with doing what was right? The healing journey from family betrayal is different for everyone, but speaking out and seeking justice often creates opportunities for authentic relationships to develop in place of manipulative ones. Thank you for listening to my story about finding real family after escaping fake family. I hope it reminds you to value the people who see you for who you really are, and to be suspicious of anyone who benefits from keeping you confused about your own capabilities. Please like this video if it resonated with you. Share it with anyone who might be dealing with similar family challenges. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming family trauma, and leave a comment about your own experiences with finding authentic relationships after manipulation. Your courage in sharing your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.